Welcome back to the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. The return of Donald Trump has refocused attention on the rivalry between Washington and Beijing in Latin America. How can countries and businesses in the region navigate those tensions in the months ahead?
There is not a single U.S. firm contracting in Peru. And I believe that the same is true of many of the Latin American countries. So my sense is that this is not about Trump or about a specific president. This is a key question of what is the role that Latin America will play in the new Trump administration and for the U.S. in the big picture. No?
In 25 years of writing about Latin America, I have never heard people talk about a port so much. But the new Peruvian facility of Chancay is not just any ordinary port. Built at a cost of $3.6 billion and run by the Chinese state company Cosco Shipping, Chancay has become a lightning rod for the bigger question of the competition between China and the United States in Latin America. Chancay will significantly reduce shipping times across the Pacific Ocean, not just for Peru, but potentially for other South American nations, including Brazil. But it could also serve a military purpose for the Chinese, and without a doubt, it marks a bigger foothold in the region for Beijing. The Biden administration was already concerned, and now it's likely to become an even bigger focal point under President Donald Trump. A key aide for the incoming administration, Mauricio Claver-Carón, recently suggested that goods imported to the United States via Chancay could face tariffs of up to 60%. Claver-Carón called it a shot across the bow for all countries in the region who might be contemplating accepting Chinese investment. On today's episode, we want to learn a little bit more about Chancay and its economic effect on Peru and the broader continent, but also get at the heart of how political and business leaders across Latin America are thinking about the U.S. versus China question as Donald Trump prepares to return to office. Our guest is Alfredo Thorne. Alfredo was Peru's finance and economy minister from 2016 to 2017 under a pro-business government. He now is principal director at Thorne & Associates, a Lima-based advisory firm. Alfredo wrote a recent article for America's Quarterly. It was called, "Can Peru Stay Neutral in the U.S.-China Trade War?" I'll be asking him that question and others today. So, Alfredo, welcome back. Happy New Year to you. We've all read and heard so much about this port, but tell me, in your vision, how much of a game changer is Chancay for Peru and for South America more broadly?
I think the press has focused on Chancay, and certainly the idea that the Chinese have opened this port is news for Peru and for Latin America. But we have to be careful because Peru is opening 8 new ports. One of them is Chancay. And when you look at the ownership of these ports, we have all type of investors. We have investors coming from the Emirates. We have the Danish. We have the Turks. The U.S. have 2 ports. They are thinking of having a 3rd port. So I think the way I look at this is that this new port investment has to do a lot with the multilateralism that Peru has practiced and is reflected in the number of free trade agreements that Peru has. It is true, however, that the Chinese are taking this opportunity to put a strong foot in Latin America. If you look at the recent past, the investment that China has done in Latin America has been huge. And that coincides with the retracement by the U.S. The U.S. has, as as my friend Kuczynski used to say, it's a forgotten continent for the U.S.
Alfredo, why is this port different from others in Peru and the rest of Latin America?
I think if you were to compare the port of Chancay with one of the ports in Callao, the DP World port, it has a greater capacity. It has also up-to-date technology. The DP World port probably is more impressive than Chancay port. What is impressive about Chancay is the new technologies that the Chinese have put in that port. You know? And the second thing that impresses us of Chancay is that it's a private port, as opposed to most of the other ports that are concessions. No,
But there are also some specific issues with Chancay, which you've mentioned. Another one is the concern that the Chinese Navy could use it strategically. You referenced this in your article for America's Quarterly, quoting General Laura Richardson, the recently retired head of U.S. Southern Command. You also talk about the fact that Cosco Shipping, the Chinese state-owned firm that built Chancay, is attempting to avoid Peruvian government oversight, specifically because of this issue that you mentioned, that Chancay is a private port as opposed to a concession. How unusual and how worrying from a strategic point of view are these factors?
the first one is the oversight of Chancay. The Chinese don't want an oversight. However, the authorities, in this case the regulator, has made it very clear that as long as this port is used for public purposes, in other words, that it does ship public cargo and it has access to the public in general, it has to be supervised. Not in the way they supervise a concession port, but it has to be supervised. We talked to the Peruvian Navy, and they have said very clearly that no Chinese Navy ship could enter into Peru waters unless that is allowed by the Peruvian Navy.
So, Alfredo, using all of this context as a preamble of sorts, let's now broaden the aperture of this conversation. You wrote a recent article for America's Quarterly. The headline was a question. The question was, can Peru stay neutral in the U.S. China trade war? How would you answer the question that you posed?
The answer is yes, and I think it should stay neutral. That's the way Peru has managed their international relations. That's what we have done in terms of free trade agreements. That's what we are doing with all these ports. The issue is whether China want to pull us in a different direction. My sense is that it was a possibility under the Biden administration. I think it's a high risk under the Trump administration. No, if Peru is going to face import duties of 65% to the participation of the China in our ports, that's bad news for Peru. That's not going to help Peru grow, and that's not the type of policies that Peru has practiced in the past. No.
So, what you're referencing there specifically is the interview that Mauricio Claver Caron, who has been appointed as the special advisor to Latin America under the incoming Trump administration, made in a recent interview with Bloomberg. In that interview, Mauricio floated the possibility of a tariff on goods coming into the United States via the port of Chancay. Um, he specifically said that this idea was meant as a shot across the bow, his phrase, to show other countries in Latin America the dangers of working with and trading with China.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. There is a very interesting anecdote of this Chinese auto company, BYD. And we always believe that the fact that China opened the Chancay port will mean that companies like BYD will invest into auto companies, into auto plants in Peru. Well, BYD, that is probably the largest automaker in China, has decided to invest in Brazil instead. And that tells us a little bit of the game plan that China has. I think Peru is a small country. It has only 33 million inhabitants, as opposed to Brazil or Mexico, where there is a lot of demand for China's products. That tells me that the big companies from China are not going to invest in Peru. They are going to invest in Brazil or in Mexico, where the big demand is. What will happen to Peru is that Peru will become a port hub, and that's probably the role that we will play in international trade.
So that's true. And I know that the BYD investment in Brazil is also on the incoming Trump team's radar. But even the port of Chancay was enough to make Peru one of the first countries in the crosshairs, if you will, for the incoming Trump team. I wanted to ask you, what was the reaction to this proposal in Peru, among the Peruvian government and in the financial and business world that you know so well?
Look, they haven't said much. As you know, we have a government that is a strange government. It's a transition government. No, President Castillo was impeached, and we will elect a new government in 2026. The new government is a leftist government and is very much in love with China. But I think that love affair is going to last until 2026, when the new government is going to take oath. And probably they are the ones that are going to decide what is the true international relations that they will want to practice in the future.
Does a kind of coercive, even punitive approach like the Trump administration is threatening to take, does it produce results, Alfredo? I mean, do you see people, sectors in Peru? You mentioned that the government's been fairly quiet, but in the private sector, which remains, of course, very influential in Peru, I mean, do you see people kind of changing their mindset as a result of Trump's election and some of these proposals that are being floated?
Look, I think what has hurt us has been a little bit the lack of uh, close relations during the Biden administration. I think clearly for the US, Latin America was not their priorities. A lot of the firms that have actually sold to the Chinese were either European or American firms, no? Which is a big pity. For instance, we have, as you know, we have our public works. We paid a lot of money to different companies, but there's not a single U.S. firm contracting in Peru. And I believe that the same is true of many of the Latin American countries. So my sense is that this is not about Trump or about a specific president. This is a key question of what is the role that Latin America will play in the new Trump administration and for the U.S. in the big picture. No?
President Biden did make it to Peru finally at the very end of his term for the APEC summit. After meeting with President Boluarte, he referred to Peru as a quote unquote valued partner. Brian Nichols, who just retired as the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, said that, quote, "We are going to prove that the best partner for Peru is the United States." You mentioned that Washington has not been very effective at that goal. On the other hand, as I've written a lot about, the United States has a clear disadvantage when it comes to competing with Chinese companies because the systems are so different. Washington cannot order its companies to go invest for long-term economic or even geopolitical reasons in the way that Beijing can. What, in your mind, would be effective mechanisms for Washington to compete better in Peru?
Let me go back in Peru's history since the 1930s and after the Second World War. the US was the main contractor in Peru. It owned large businesses in agriculture, in manufacturing, in infrastructure. And I think even they own most of the ports that we're talking. Since that period, obviously, we have a period, reformist period of the time of the militaries, where they expropriate most of these companies. But what I'm trying to tell you is that Peru has been a very strong US partner in trade and in businesses in the past. And I don't see why that cannot happen again. I think it's simply a matter of connecting the dots. I'll tell you an idea that I have. If I were in the government, I would be going to Asia and promoting the fact that we have these 8 ports, and that will allow most of the semiconductors that are today are in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, et cetera, to settle in Peru and export into the US. No, that could be a huge business for the US because most of these companies want to be close to the US and access free trade agreements as the ones that we have. So the issue is, how do we make that happen? And I think neither the US nor Peru have actually looked into that in detail. And I think that's what we have to do.
The great journalist Alex Quadros has a new book out. It's called When We Sold God's Eye: Diamonds, Murder, and a Clash of Worlds in the Amazon. The book tells the story of the Cinta Larga, a tribe that had no contact with the outside world until the 1960s and came to run an illegal diamond mine in the Amazon. We'll be hosting Alex here at the Americas Society in New York City on January 15th to discuss the book. The event will be free of charge and followed by a reception. You can register on our website. That's americasquarterly.org. We hope to see you there. Alfredo, you mentioned the fact that we have elections coming up in 2026. They're unpredictable. Peruvian politics has been especially unpredictable over the last 10 years, as I'm sure you'd agree. But you said in your article for AQ that it seems that Peru is likely to move more toward the United States over time. Why do you think that's the case?
Look, I think when you look at long-term trends and what we get from China, what we get from the US, from China, the only thing we do is export minerals. And actually, I have to say, we export rocks, no? Because not even that those minerals are processed in Peru. No? We have only one mine, which is Tia Maria, that is trying to put a smelter in the south. This is the Grupo Mexico. But most of the other mines are chips that are full of rocks and go to China. We don't have a single transfer of technology from China to Peru. And we don't have any plans of any of those companies, for instance, the big car companies, that will come and settle here and make a transfer of technology. When the US invests in Peru, they do transfer in technology. And that has been our experience. Most of the value-added exports go into the US. So for us, it's relatively easy to link most of the US partners that are in Asia and that today they can move into Latin America and take advantage of these free trade agreements with Europe, with the US, and actually move towards a different type of growth pattern that we have had in the past. That's my idea.
Alfredo, moving maybe just beyond Peru for a moment, this whole conversation, you've done a great job describing kind of the nuances and the challenges that exist for Washington and for Beijing and for a country like Peru that's trying to navigate these waters. For Latin America more broadly, I mean, look, I've traveled the region a lot in recent years. I meet with political leaders and business leaders all the time. And people on left, center, and right generally tend to agree that their biggest nightmare is being forced to choose between Washington and Beijing. Now we're looking at a moment where, as you noted, Washington is really likely to increase the pressure to choose. How do you think countries, governments and companies around the region should navigate those tensions in the coming months?
I don't know. I don't want to outguess President Trump, but it seems that he will have to choose his battles. And I think one battle that he doesn't want to have is fight against all of Latin America. I think there are very valuable countries that today need the US. The most apparent one is Milei today with Argentina. There are changes taking place. Let's see what happened with Venezuela these days. Colombia is also changing. Peru is changing. So my sense is that giving your back to all these changes as the US, I would say is crazy. I think it's not going to help the US at all. No, I think this idea that you don't want to have your enemies in your backyard, that was the policy of many years ago in the US, has gone all the opposite direction. And my sense is that the US has to rethink what they want to do out of Latin America. No?
But you do have a lot of people in this incoming administration who openly believe and espouse the Monroe Doctrine, the now 201-year-old idea that foreign powers should not be present in the Western Hemisphere. Today, that means mainly China, but it's also frequently applied to Russia and Iran. My feeling that broader strategic game may outweigh worries about offending specific governments and constituencies around the region. I mean, this seems like a line that Trump's people seem really eager to draw.
Look, we've lived that sort of division in the world in the 1970s, if you remember. We were part of that group. We didn't get much out of that. Actually, were the worst periods in Latin America. But when you look at Peru and you say, where does Peru bank? Where does they issue their bonds? Do they issue their bonds in China? Is China going to buy our bonds? No. Where do they get their technology? Is China going to give the technology to Peru? And the answer to all those questions is no. I think my reading is that aside from the philosophical differences of the different governments, we remain a very Occidental pro-market continent, and that cannot be changed.
It sounds to me, Alfredo, like at some level what you're saying is Peru is likely to continue moving in a pro-U.S. direction anyway. Don't rock the boat too much. Is that about right?
Look, I give you an anecdote that actually captures this discussion. The port of Chancay was offered to the Americans first, and the Americans turned it down. You say that the US cannot do these investments. The US has done these investments in the past. The US has 2 ports in Peru. So I think obviously the big difference between Cosco and a US firm is that the US firm has to look at the profitability of that investment. But is it profitable to transport 6 or 7 million containers to Asia? I think it is. So I'll say when the US authorities come and tell us, look, the US does not do things like China, I think, wait a minute, this is a very profitable undertaking. And this is a miss for many of the US companies. What is going to happen with the US and their 2 ports looking at the Pacific, San Francisco and Los Angeles? Can they expand those ports? No, they can't. They have to look for an alternative. And the Chinese have sort of opened the eyes of the Americans, say, well, yes, here is the alternative, no? Probably those port contractors in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, probably they should have been investing in Chancay.
Alfredo, on that note, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.